Okay, so today I thought we could talk about someone whose stories basically shaped a lot of our childhoods. And honestly, whose real life was almost stranger than the books he wrote. I'm talking about Roald Dahl. And if you grew up reading Matilda, the BFG, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or The Witches, then you probably picture him as this gentle, grandfatherly storyteller sitting at a desk inventing chocolate rivers and giant peaches. But the funny thing is, the real Roald Dahl was kind of intense. Like extremely tall, extremely stubborn, occasionally mischievous in ways that would probably get you expelled today. And he lived a life that included plane crashes, espionage rumours, movie stars, chocolate companies secretly sending him sweets, and some very strange inventions. So, we're going to walk through his life together, and trust me, some of this stuff sounds like it came straight out of one of his own books. So, let's get into it. Roald Dahl was born in 1916 in Cardiff, Wales. His parents were actually wealthy Norwegian immigrants, which is already kind of interesting because it means he grew up speaking Norwegian at home and English everywhere else. He didn't speak Welsh because by the late 1800s, English became the dominant language in most of South Wales. And the name Roald? Well, his parents chose it after the famous Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who was the first person to reach the South Pole. So basically from birth, there was already this sort of adventurous expectation attached to him. But his early childhood wasn't particularly easy. When Roald was only 3 years old, his older sister Astrid died from appendicitis. And just a few weeks later, his father died of pneumonia. So suddenly, his mother, bless her, was left raising several children on her own. Now here's something that always stuck with me about his mother. She had the option to move her family back to Norway, where she would have had more support from family. But she decided to stay in Wales because she chose to honour her late husband's wish of sending their children to the best schools in the world, which they believed were in Britain. Ironically, Roald Dahl absolutely hated school, like really hated it. Which becomes important later because many of the awful adult characters in his books, especially the terrifying headmistress Miss Trunchbull in Matilda, were heavily inspired by his own teachers. And honestly, the things he describes from school sound like they belong in a slightly horrifying Victorian novel. One of my favourite stories from Dahl's childhood is something he later called The Great Mouse Plot, which honestly sounds like the title of one of his own books. So, when he was about 8 years old, there was this local sweet shop run by an older woman who Dahl described as extremely unpleasant. Apparently, she was mean to the kids, suspicious of them, and generally not a warm person. So Dahl and his friends decide to take revenge, and their plan was to put a dead mouse inside one of the sweet jars. Yes, a real dead mouse. They snuck into the shop, dropped the mouse into a jar of gobstoppers, and they ran away. Now, in their minds, this was hilarious. But the next day, they were called into the headmaster's office, where they were all given the cane. Which, if you're not familiar, was basically being hit with a stick, or a cane, as punishment in school. Thankfully, the cane became outlawed in public schools in Wales in 1987, and outlawed in private schools in 1998. Dahl later wrote that the experience left him furious and humiliated, and his mother had him moved to a different school after this incident, as it affected him quite a lot. And this moment, kids rebelling against cruel adults, is basically a reoccurring theme in his books. You can see it in Matilda, in the Twits, and even in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. The kids in his stories often outsmart the adults, which may have been wishful thinking. When Dahl was 13, he was sent to boarding school. And again, he hated it. He described the food as terrible, the rules as absurd, and the teachers as tyrants. But something interesting happened while he was there. Cadbury, the chocolate company, would occasionally send boxes of new chocolate bars to the school for the students to test. So the boys would try the experimental chocolates and they would write feedback. And Dahl later said that this made him dream of one day inventing a chocolate bar so amazing that even Mr. Cadbury himself would be impressed. Which, if you're thinking, wait, that kind of sounds like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, then you're absolutely right. Willy Wonka and his magical chocolate inventions were partly inspired by Dahl's childhood memories of those Cadbury tasting sessions. So, in a way, the book had kind of already started as a kid daydreaming about chocolate. If you've made it this far, I just want to say a big thank you. I appreciate you, and feel free to subscribe, to like this video, and share. Okay, let's get back into it. Now here's another thing that might surprise people. Roald Dahl never went to university, which, considering he became one of the most famous writers in the world, is kind of crazy. Instead, after finishing school when he was 17, he went to work for Shell, the oil company, as an apprentice, completing 4 years of training. And then Shell sent him abroad. First to Kenya, and then to Tanzania. And imagine being in your early 20s, in the 1930s, suddenly living in East Africa. This was probably the first time Dahl really experienced the wider world outside of Europe. But then, World War II began. And Dahl made a decision that would completely change his life. He joined the Royal Air Force and trained as a fighter pilot, which already kind of sounds like the backstory of some action movie hero. But during a flight over the Libyan desert in 1940, something went terribly wrong. He was flying a Gladiator biplane, which already sounds fragile, and he ran out of fuel while trying to land in an unfamiliar airstrip. The plane crashed hard. His skull fractured, his nose was smashed, and he temporarily lost his sight. Doctors later said he was very lucky to survive. But somehow, after just months of recovery, he went back to flying, which is honestly kind of unbelievable. He went on to fly several combat missions over Greece, but eventually he started experiencing severe headaches and blackouts, likely connected to his crash injuries. So he was grounded. He couldn't fly again. And this is where his life takes another strange turn. Because suddenly, instead of flying planes, Roald Dahl was sent to Washington, D.C. Roald Dahl the spy, perhaps? In Washington, Dahl worked as an air attaché, which sounds very official and boring. But according to several historians, he was also involved in British intelligence. And there's still debate about exactly what he did there. But we do know he became very well connected with powerful Americans, politicians, writers, socialites, and yes, movie stars. Dahl was very tall. He was 6'6", and apparently quite charming, which made him useful in diplomatic circles. Some reports say he gathered information and tried to influence American support for Britain during the war. So somewhere out there in history is this version of Roald Dahl attending glamorous parties in Washington while quietly reporting things back to British intelligence. Which is honestly not the version of him most people imagine. Now, let's talk about how he became a writer. So the writing career actually started by accident. While Dahl was in Washington, the author C.S. Forester, who wrote naval adventure stories, asked him to describe his plane crash experience. So, Roald Dahl wrote down his story. Forester was so impressed with his writing, he sent it to a magazine. And just like that, Dahl became a published writer. The piece appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. And Dahl suddenly realised, oh, maybe I'm good at this. Now here's a fun little plot twist. In the 1950s, Roald Dahl married actress Patricia Neal. She was a huge Hollywood star at the time, like Oscar-winning, major movie roles, the whole thing. So imagine this tall British writer who used to be a fighter pilot, married to one of the biggest actresses in Hollywood. Their life together was dramatic in ways that honestly sounds like another novel. They had 5 children, but they also went through several tragedies. Their son, Theo, suffered a severe head injury as a baby when his stroller was hit by a taxi, which later inspired Dahl to help invent a medical device called the Wade-Dahl Till Valve. It helped treat hydrocephalus in children, which means Roald Dahl technically helped invent a life-saving medical device. I feel like that fact alone deserves its own story. And then another tragedy. In 1962, Dahl's daughter Olivia died from measles at age 7, and this loss devastated him. Years later, Dahl became a strong advocate for measles vaccination. He even wrote a letter urging parents to vaccinate their children, explaining how preventable Olivia's death might have been. It's one of the most personal and emotional things he's ever wrote. So during all of this, family life, inventions, tragedies, Dahl was also writing. And his style was unusual. Children's books at the time tended to be polite and moralistic. Dahl's stories, however, were mischievous, grotesque, sometimes a little dark, and adults were often ridiculous villains. Children were clever rebels, and the language itself was playful. He invented words constantly, like scrumdiddlyumptious, oompa-loompas, whiz-poppers. He loved the sound of nonsense, and kids loved it too. Okay, so now I have to tell you about his writing shed, because it's one of the quirkiest things about him, I think. Behind his house in England, Dahl had a small shed where he wrote all of his books. Inside was an old armchair, with a wooden board across the arms as a makeshift desk. He kept his feet in a sleeping bag to keep warm. He wrote with yellow pencils. He sharpened them in a very specific way. He also had odd little objects around him for inspiration, including a ball made from the silver wrappers of chocolate bars, which he had been adding to for years. It's basically a giant chocolate wrapper sculpture. Dahl wrote for exactly 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon. No more, no less. He believed creativity worked best in short bursts. So he'd sit in his shed, scribble on yellow legal pads, and slowly build his stories. He also reportedly ate the same lunch every single day, which I admire and can relate to. One thing people always noticed about Dahl was his height. It always came up in conversations. I mean, after all, he was extremely tall. And apparently he loved telling exaggerated stories at dinner parties. Friends said you could never completely tell whether Dahl was telling the truth or inventing something on the spot. Which again feels very on brand for someone who created Giant Peaches and Friendly Giants. Speaking of giants, Dahl actually recorded himself reading the BFG out loud to help shape the giant's unusual speech patterns. He loved playing with how words sounded, and if you read the dialogue out loud, it's almost musical. That playful language is part of what makes his books feel so alive. Dahl continued writing into the 1980s. He wrote The Witches, The Twits, George's Marvellous Medicine, and many others. His stories became hugely popular worldwide. But he still wrote in that same garden shed, still using pencils, still surrounded by strange little objects. Dahl died in 1990 at age 74, and he was buried with some unusual items, including his snooker cues, some chocolates, and a bottle of Burgundy wine, which feels like a very Roald Dahl way to go. Today his books have sold hundreds of millions of copies. They've been translated into dozens of languages, and many of his books became films, musicals, and stage shows. But I think what makes Dahl special is that he never talked down to children. His stories were weird, sometimes gross, sometimes a little scary. But he trusted the kids to handle all of that. And the kids loved him for it. So it kind of feels very fitting that Dahl's life was so imaginative. A Norwegian boy in Wales, a mischievous kid putting mice into sweet jars, a fighter pilot, possibly a spy, an inventor, and eventually one of the most beloved storytellers in the world. Honestly, if someone wrote his life as a novel, people might say it was unrealistic. But somehow, it all actually happened, and the world is a little more magical because of it.